What role do you think Donald Trump plays in this?
That's a really hard question to answer. So let's look at different possibilities. Okay, the first possibility is that he's been employed as an actor and he's just following a script. He doesn't really know where this movie is going. He's just doing his part, but he's manipulated behind the scenes by people around him. And when reporters asked him, like, why is this war in Iran happening? He did say that his advisors, which include Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, Peter Hegseth, Marco Rubio, told him that the Iranians were so close to getting a nuclear weapon and that the Iranians were going to attack first. And so I was basically misled. And I think that's probably true in that Trump surrounds himself with certain people that have a certain political eschatological agenda. So that's one possibility, that he's just an actor. Another possibility is that he himself has a messianic calling. Okay. And what I mean by that is, if you go back to January 2021, he was politically dead, right? Because the January 6th riots happened. He was impeached twice. And then after he left office, there was lawfare conducted against him and he went bankrupt. So it was as though the entire world went against him. But now he's president of the United States. And so how would he personally understand this? I think a lot of it is God has asked him to serve. There's a call to serve, and he has to fulfill a mission. But what this mission is, okay? What this mission is, whether it's to save Israel, whether it's to save America, whether it's a part of a grander scheme, only he in his heart knows. And I think no one except him knows, okay? So I think that's another possibility. And the third possibility is that this is all Israel's doing. Netanyahu is the one who's forced him into this sort of situation because the Israelis attacked first. And Marco Rubio said this, where, you know what, we wanted these negotiations, but the Israelis were planning to attack. If they attacked, the Iranians would be compelled to attack both the Americans and the Israelis. And we did not want to put our soldiers in harm's way, so we attacked with the Israelis. Okay, so it's possible this is all Netanyahu and all his machinations. And another fourth possibility is they have co-opted him. Like, there's blackmail on him. And he has absolutely no choice but to do what he says because he's compromised in a certain way, and maybe his family is under threat. So all four are possibilities. And quite honestly, I have no idea which possibility is the most correct. From a geopolitical perspective, if America is forced to retreat back into the Western Hemisphere, it needs to worry about resources. And so it is in the best interest of America to eventually take over and colonize both Canada and Mexico.
Yes.
Mexico for its labor supply, Canada for its resources. Canada's probably the wealthiest country in the world.
I know.
And so from a geopolitical perspective, if the world is retreating into self-sufficiency, if there's mercantilism, if there's trade barriers, then America has absolutely no choice but to ensure its own supply networks. And that means eventually taking over Greenland, Canada, Mexico, Latin America, Cuba, Venezuela. So America doesn't really have much choice in this matter. At the same time, what we're seeing is that this war, as well as other events, are causing political fissures in America, especially between left and right. So witness what happened in Minneapolis in January, right? And so we can expect that as this war continues, and there's a strong possibility that Donald Trump will call up a national draft in order to ensure the manpower to fight this war, then you will have rioting in the streets, you have massive violence, in which case the National Guard is deployed. There's a plan to deploy the National Guard to all major American cities by April. And so, unfortunately, America is probably going to suffer many years of sectarian violence. Not a full-fledged civil war, but maybe something along the lines of the Troubles in Ireland. I'm not sure if you've seen this terrible movie called One Battle After Another. It's just a terrible movie, by the way, but it gives you insight into what a civil war might look like, where you have these insurgent groups fighting against the state. So yeah.
But you expect the United States to hang together as a coherent nation state.
Listen, Tucker, the United States is the greatest nation in the world. The people are open, generous, entrepreneurial, energetic. The resources of America are infinite. America is a kind of a fortress so that it's protected by two oceans. America doesn't have a peer competitor in North America and South America. And so, I mean, America, regardless of what happens, America will still come out doing pretty well just because of the pure energy and creativity of its people.
So a lot of the problem is that if you look at empires in decline, they're no longer capable of strategic planning because there's a lethal and toxic combination of hubris and desperation. And so Washington, D.C. has become an insular bubble, right? And if you just look at these press conferences where reporters are like, hey, Mr. Trump, what's the plan here? And then Trump's like, shut up, man. I'm gonna put you in jail. In fact, I'm gonna pass a law that says if you criticize us in the war, we're gonna put you all in jail, right? Or we're gonna shoot you to death, right? That's how empires behave. And so at this stage where empires are in decline and the leadership is unwilling to admit any possibility of defeat, and they're just trying to force everyone to repeat talking points, right? So Peter Hegseth in his press conferences is just saying like, the problem with you guys is you don't talk about the good things. All you talk about is the bad things. Stop talking about the bad things. You just focus on the good things, and then we're good, okay? And what he doesn't recognize is like, I'm sorry, but like the war's going bad. You need to hear it, and they absolutely refuse to hear it, okay? So why empires decline is they become so arrogant and so insular that they refuse to consider the possibility of defeat, so that they always double down. And I don't know how you resolve this issue. Right now, there's a talk of war. So it's almost impossible for us to ascertain who's winning this war, because the Israelis and Americans are doing tremendous damage to Iran. The Iranians are fighting back as well. So we can't actually ascertain who's actually winning this war. But if you just look at historical examples, if you just look at game theory, then the idea is the Americans are stuck where they are, and they can only double down. Because if they ever quit, right, it's sunk cost fallacy. It's like you go to a casino and you're losing $100,000. If you quit now, you'll always lose that money, so you keep on gambling, okay? So unfortunately, what game theory suggests is that Trump's just gonna double down. And so I think what he's gonna do is he's gonna take Clark Island, and he'll do it very easily. And then he'll want to secure the coast as well. And so you have mission creep. And unfortunately, he's being egged on by both Israel and the GCC, because Israel clearly wants this war to escalate. And the GCC wants to remove the Iranian threat as soon as possible because they see the amount of damage that the Iranians can do to the GCC. So Dubai, if nothing changes, Dubai will just cease to exist because Dubai is just based on the perception that it's a safe tax haven, right? But if Iran can just rain drones on Dubai uncontested, then no one's going to put their money in Dubai. So for Dubai to continue to thrive, it needs to destroy Iran and remove that threat from the Middle East. So unfortunately, the way that things are structured suggests that this war can only escalate and not actually move towards a ceasefire. So we know the cause is not Iran's nuclear program, because a few hours before the Israelis struck Tehran and killed the Ayatollah, the Omani foreign minister went on TV and said that the Iranians had already agreed to zero uranium enrichment, even for civilian purposes, which was before a red line. So we know that the nuclear program is not the real cause. And in fact, Trump has yet to articulate a good reason for why this war started in the first place. Now that the reason the administration is articulating to the public is that, well, the Israelis were going to strike first. And if that were to happen, the Iranians would have struck back at both the Israelis and the Americans. And therefore, the Americans had to preempt the Iranians. And that's why the Americans went in with the Israelis. So this is a war that is looking for a purpose and a strategy. And maybe 100 years from now, historians will still argue over why this war started in the first place. So let's go over some possibilities. So the first possibility is that this war had to happen. And the reason why is the nature of the American empire. The American empire, its power rests mainly on its ability to control maritime trade. It's able to control key maritime choke points, like the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Gibraltar. And the great fear is that the Eurasian continent would unify under great power. And so in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a British strategist named Harold Mackinder, and he argued that the greatest threat to the British Empire was the rise of a Eurasian power, whether it be the Ottoman Empire, whether it be the French, the Germans, or the Russians. Because if that power were to arise, that power would unify both Europe and Asia and connect the entire Eurasian continent through railways, and then absorb the Middle East and Africa and Southeast Asia into a continental trading bloc that would negate the naval power of the British Empire. And the British Empire only had naval power. It didn't have the population to sustain a land army. We saw that in World War I and World War II. So the entire strategy of the British was to cause as much discontent and chaos in Eurasia as possible. And if a great power were to arise, they basically go to war against that power. So we first saw the strategy play out during the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon basically unified Europe. And then what Britain did was fight seven wars against Napoleon. They lost 6, and they won the 7th.
Do you think that the Brits at that point saw that as an existential threat, and that's why they were going that hard?
Yes, they did, because Napoleon wanted to institute something called the continental system. So basically just blockade England. Because remember, Britain is a resource-poor island. So they were blocked off from the European continent. And if Napoleon was able to embargo them, then they would have starved, basically. There's also another issue in that there are 2 main sources of British imperial power. The first, of course, is the Royal Navy. The second, which is actually more important, is the Bank of England. And so the Bank of England was chartered in 1694. 1688 was the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution is important because that's when basically the Dutch Republic merged with the British Empire. And the merger happened because when the Dutch princes, William Orange, went over to England to become their king, something called the Glorious Revolution. And when that happened, when the Dutch aristocracy went over to England, they also brought with them their capital and their wealth. And so they set up the Bank of England as a private bank that would serve British monarchical interests. So previously, before, if you're a merchant, you lent money to a king to fight his wars. The problem with that is that, well, the king could die, or the king could lose the war, or the king could just renege on his promise and said, you know what, I'm the king, you can't do anything about me, so screw off, okay? So there was a lot of risk involved in lending money to a king. Now, the great innovation of the Bank of England is that you no longer let money to a king, you just let money to the parliament, the nation state. So when you do that, then everyone in the nation, including the children, the grandchildren, are now obligated to pay you back, okay? And in America, this became the Federal Reserve System. So in other words, all this wealth in Europe that was looking for stability all went to England, including the Dutch Republic, but also including the Habsburgs, including the Catholic Church. And so that allowed England infinite financing for wars. So even though it could not produce a land army, it could give you the financing to fight Napoleon, and that's what led to the 7 Napoleonic Wars. But the problem with this is that once you start to fight a war, you have to keep on fighting, because if you lost, then you lose all your money, right? So it's almost like a Ponzi scheme. And so that's what led to the Napoleonic Wars. And again, in the seventh war, Britain was able to force an indemnity onto the French, and that saved the British system. So after the French came the Russians, which led to the Russian Great Game, which let's even call the Great Game between Britain and Russia in Central Asia. Right. So we have to remember, like, much of the reason why Britain was able to keep its enemies in the heartland at bay was because it allied itself with the Germans, right? So basically it was an alliance with the Prussians that allowed the British to defeat the French at the end of the day. But in the late 19th century, about 1870, Germany unified under Bismarck. And now they have their own ambitions. And now Britain came into conflict with Germany. The Germans were extremely technologically advanced. They had the best universities. They were extremely sophisticated, cultured people, just the best philosophy in the world. And they had the best general staff in the world. So Britain found a tremendous adversary in Germany, so much so that it took 2 world wars to defeat Germany. So we can argue about the causes of World War I, but most historians agree that World War I was caused because Britain was the hegemon and Germany was the challenger, a rising power that threatened the economic imperial security of Britain. And that's what ultimately led to this World War I. And America came into the war because, quite honestly, it seemed as though Germany was going to triumph in the end. So it took basically an entire global alliance to defeat Germany in World War I. The travesty of World War I is that in the Versailles Conference, the Allies made Germany take all the guilt for causing World War I, which was extremely unfair and inappropriate. And it basically laid the seeds for World War II. And so you have World War II, and now Germany is spreading across Europe, and Germany decides to attack Soviet Union, which is communist. And you would think that America and Britain would fight alongside the Nazis, but instead they chose to support Stalin. And again, the reason why is the Heartland McKenna thesis. You cannot allow a great power to emerge in the Eurasian continent. And at that time, it seemed that Germany was ascendant, right? Because if you marry German technology and logistics organization with Russian manpower and resources, then this is the empire that rules the world. So America could not allow that to happen. But both World War I and World War II exhausted Britain, and it forced the peaceful transfer of imperial power from Britain to America. And this was cemented in something called the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, which established the global financial order that we live in today.
So why did we accept this idea of trying to patrol the entire world via the seas? Was it just the call of being the imperial leader is so strong and so intoxicating that we're willing to take on the risk of empire? Or was it that, well, that's what we're going to have to do to make sure that the dollar remains the world's reserve currency?
Right. So I think that at the end of World War II, first of all, there was a lot of tremendous goodwill among the Europeans for what America did, right? I mean, because Americans made a lot of sacrifices to save Europe from fascism. And so the Europeans were very grateful. And the real concern was that if America retreated back into its continental fortress, which is what America did at the end of World War I, then another threat would arise in Europe, possibly the Soviet Union, right? Well, I mean, obviously the Soviet Union. And so the Europeans were very much interested in ensuring that America stayed interested in European affairs. And that's what led to the NATO alliance and the Marshall Plan. And America itself recognized that if it did not help the Europeans, then communism was ascended. Communism had already won in the Soviet Union, and it was clearly going to triumph in China. And so now you have a combination of both Soviet Union and China. And so that really scared American policy makers. So it was in their best interest to revitalize the Europeans and the Japanese as soon as possible. And that's what led, of course, to the Marshall Plan. So I think that it was a combination of idealism and a combination of goodwill, as well as just realpolitik, long-term strategic planning. Okay, so to answer this question, we have to look at what America's major imperial innovation was. Okay, so in the Bretton Woods Conference, 1944, was to establish the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, right? Something called the exorbitant privilege. And America did this to the benefit of Europe, because what this meant was that America was basically financing the reconstruction of Europe and Japan, right? Because Europe was devastated by war, and they needed to rebuild the factories and manufacturing, but they needed an outlet, needed consumers, right? So Americans agreed to buy from Europe, and America would also sell to Europe, okay? And the point was to very quickly build the manufacturing capacity of Europe as well as America. And this was all made possible because of the US dollar. The problem is that when you have fiat currency, there's always a risk that you print too much money, that you lose financial discipline. So the agreement was that US dollar would be pegged to gold. So at any time, Europeans could reimburse the US dollars for gold. And so the US dollar basically became a contract between the Europeans and the Americans. And this worked out really well for the first 10 years, and it led to tremendous post-war prosperity. But over time, the Americans started to overreach, started to abuse this exorbitant privilege in Vietnam, right? So basically, America was financing this silly war in Vietnam that served no strategic purpose. And then you had the space race, where America was spending billions of dollars to send a man to the moon. And then there was the Great Society of Lyndon B. Johnson, which was tremendous for the American people, but it made the Europeans question how much gold the Americans actually had at Fort Knox. So the French famously sent a frigate, a ship to New York to pick up their gold and take it back to France. And after that led to something called the Nixon shock in 1971, where Richard Nixon said that the US dollar would no longer be pegged to gold. Now you have a problem. Like, if you're not pegged to gold, then how do you determine the value of your currency? And so Nixon did two things, which was crucial, and which basically established the world order that we live in today, okay? The first thing he did was he signed a deal with Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia would only sell its oil in US dollars. And that led to something called the petrodollar, right? Which is now the basis of the US dollar. But the other thing that Nixon did was also very important, which people don't really discuss, is he went to China and he made a deal with China to become trading partners, where China would basically export its cheap labor, and in return, they would get US dollars, right? So these two deals, okay, the petrodollar as well as China become the factory of the world, became the basis of the new global economy. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, this system then became the global financial order. And this was fine. The problem is that there was excess capital being produced around the world, and it all went to America. And at this time, America was shifting its manufacturing to China. So the economy of America became very unbalanced, and it shifted from a focus on manufacturing to a focus on financing. So Wall Street started to, explode in both financial and political power, and that led to hubris. And then Wall Street, because it had to create financial vehicles to absorb all this foreign capital, started to invent all these risky derivatives, such as the CDOs, collateral debt obligations. And this, of course, led to the 2008 subprime crisis. And at this point in history, essentially, the entire global economy should have collapsed. Why? Because Wall Street had basically bundled the entire global economy together so that if one part of the system collapsed, the entire system collapsed. And I know that you've shared this very well with your audience, so I won't go too much into it. The system didn't collapse because something happened, which is that China bailed out the world by printing all this money to build infrastructure throughout China, okay? So China basically became the consumer for the world, gobbling up all these raw materials in order to build its skyscrapers, its high-speed rail. And that worked out really well for the world. But then China said, well, you know what? Before we were exporting our cheap labor, and now we are financing the global economy. So we want to have a greater say over global affairs. We want our companies like Huawei to go to Africa and sell our products and compete against Apple. And the Americans didn't like that. And that's what led to the Trump tariffs when he came into office in 2016, right? The first thing he did was to sanction these Chinese companies. And that's what led to the trade war. And so you have all this instability now in the system because China's trying to contribute heavily to the global economy, but it wants more political power because of this. And Americans are, no, we are still the hegemon. You have to listen to us. So the 2008 great financial crisis was a heavy blow. Then this trade war of China was also another heavy blow.